When I was young, like a teenager young, I remember being in the house and it was dark and it was night and no one was in the room with me, and I heard this really loud noise. Like so loud, it was like the walls of the house were starting to tremor. Like it freaked me out. And in that moment, I believed that the rapture had come. That noise was the sound of Jesus taking all those who are to be his, to be with him, and I had been left behind. That's what I thought. So I remember just panically just looking through my house, looking for my parents, expecting to find a pile of clothes where their body used to be, because they had been taken, I had been left, and I was freaking out. Of course, in retrospect, that loud noise was not a rapture. It was a large plane flying low overhead of my house. And of course, I found my parents, and they were there, and they were okay, and they hadn't been taken, and I hadn't been left behind. Christ had not yet returned. But I remember the fear and the panic and the freak-outedness that I faced. And when we as Christians look at the end times, we do have a tendency to just take bits and pieces of what we've heard and what we've believed and enable that to kind of form in our head what we think is going to happen in the future, in the end times. But what we will find today is that in fact there are many different ways of looking at the end times. And where you land on each one of these four camps, then it will change how you understand the end times. It will change what in your mind is going to happen next. Because in most of these, what happens next looks very different. So what we're going to do today then is start to wrestle with this concept of what happens next and looking at the four camps in order to try and get there. We are in the middle of our Bigger Question series. This kind of led into a Reading Revelation mini-series that we're currently in. And yes, last week we looked at how to read the book of Revelation. And we landed on things like we need to look at context, we need to look at the genre of the book. For example, Revelation is apocalyptic literature. We talked about how being apocalyptic literature, it is best to be understood symbolically and not literally. And that we get into a trouble when we pick and choose what bits of Revelation we want to read symbolically and what bits of Revelation we want to read literally. And then we talked about the need to allow the Bible to interpret the Bible. And for other passages to kind of encourage or take away from our working theory. And that's kind of what we looked at last week. Then we applied that to the mark of the beast, particularly in relation to the theory that the COVID vaccine is the mark of the beast. Now today then, what we want to do is start to unpack the four viewpoints on how we understand the end times. So to put this in a different way, we will be looking at the eschatological ruminations of the classifications of the four ways of understanding the viewpoints of the eschatology. We'll be looking at postmillennialism, premillennialism, which goes into two subcategories of historic premillennialism and dispensational premillennialism, and then we'll look at amillennialism. Have I lost anyone yet? Have I kept anyone yet? So, I've talked about in the past, sometimes when I preach, I will preach in practical, pastoral terms, looking for applications that we can then put into our lives. But sometimes I will need to do a sermon that's a little bit more Bible college lecturing, okay? And that's because we have questions, and sometimes the answers to that uses very big words. And that is what we find today when we look at the end times. These are very big words, but I think we can break them down into what they are saying about the end times. And in doing so, we can kind of land somewhere. That is our goal. I will not answer every question you have on the end times today. I will not answer every question you have on Revelations 20. I will not answer every question you have on any one of these four different camps, because I don't have all the answers. We're just starting to wrestle with these concepts to get more of an understanding of what happens next. Now, as we begin to talk, we need to note the danger of falling into a position that we don't actually understand. I'll give you an example of this. I was asked a couple of years ago what English Premier League team that I follow. Now, I don't like soccer. Yes, I'm going into my 5th year of coaching my children in soccer, but as a whole, I'd much rather playing basketball than soccer. I'm not a soccer fan at all. And I don't follow Australian soccer, let alone English Premier League soccer. It's not my sport, right? But when I was asked this question, I felt like I had to pick a camp. Like I had to pick a team and kind of claim that as my own, right? And so I knew a guy who really liked Chelsea, and so I said I follow Chelsea. It could have easily been Liverpool, and let's be honest, Sam Toy would have been a lot happier with me if he did, okay? But I didn't, I chose Chelsea. And because the guy I respected liked Chelsea, I thought, sure, I'll do that as well. I know nothing about Chelsea. I don't know where Chelsea is in England. I could not name you a player or a coach, past or present, in the Chelsea team. I don't know their cultural ethos. I don't understand how they think, what they value as a team. As far as I can tell, Chelsea could be the English Premier League version of Manly or the Roosters or Melbourne Storm, and I would be disappointed if that was the case. I do not know, for I know nothing about Chelsea. But when forced to pick, I went, sure, I'll pick Chelsea. See, sometimes in relation to the end times as a Christian, we come to our position cobbled together by bits and pieces that we've heard, and we go, sure, I'll believe that. But we don't have a real understanding of it. We don't understand how they got to the position that they got to. And sometimes I would argue that if we did, we might not still hold that position. I think as Christians, we get scared of revelation, and so we put all of this in the too hard basket. And that is a choice that we can make. But if we want to hold to a position of the end times, then we kind of need to understand a little bit more about it in order to own it, rather than holding something that we don't necessarily get or understand in any way. All right, the next thing we need to note as we start to look at these four categories, this is a grey area. Godly, wise, Christian men and women have studied this and they fall into different camps, and it is okay. I will say my position today, but my position could be different than your position, and guess what? It doesn't matter. We're still brothers and sisters in Christ. You can still come to our church. I'll still be partying with you in heaven. There's no issue there. Okay? We've talked about it in the past. As a Christian, there are closed hand issues and open hand issues. Okay? Closed hand issues is like Jesus Christ is God. The Trinity, the atonement, the resurrection, death and resurrection and ascension of Jesus Christ, and all that that entails and all that that gains those who believe in him. That is closed hand issues, right? But then there are open handed. So if you disagree with me on this, we've got words. Okay, I've got questions where you're at. But then there are a whole heap of other issues in the Christian faith, like men and women gender roles, like spiritual gifts, like views on baptism, that are open hand. We can disagree, and that's okay. We can disagree, and I will still see you in heaven, and there's no issue with that. Well, then these four different ways of looking at the end times falls into the open hand. And we must humble ourselves and not be so arrogant to think that we have the one true answer and everyone else is wrong. I have a position on this, but I could be wrong. I could be wrong. And we need to not grasp at it so tightly to allow that to then think less of those who think differently. The last thing is, even with all these four positions that we'll get to, they all agree on the big ticket items. That is, Christ is coming again. Christ will gather all of those who are his to be with him in blessed eternity. There will be judgment for the living and the dead. Those who are his get him, those who don't do not, and will be punished for their rejection of Jesus Christ. And then there is the new heavens and the new earth. These are the big ticket items on the end times that all of the different parties agree with. And so that's worth remembering too. It's not all about the differences. There is a lot of the same things. Okay. So then we look at the positions. And they all base around this passage in Revelations 20 verse 3. He threw him into the abyss and locked and sealed it over him to keep him from deceiving the nations anymore until 1,000 years were ended. After that, he must be set free for a short time. This refers to the millennium. 1,000 years time period, depending on how you read it, that refers to the reign of Christ on earth. Because how we understand that 1,000-year period changes our view and understanding of the end times, changes how we view what is going to come up next. So then you've got your four camps. There is the post-millennial, the premillennial, that then goes into two different ones. Historic, which there is called post-tribulational premillennialism, and then dispensational premillennialism, and then you have amillennialism. But the core of each of these 4 different categories is what you do with this 1,000 years in Revelation 20 verse 3. Now this is an in-house debate amongst Christians, and the difference between these camps often comes with how you read Scripture, with how you understand the Bible, with how you understand God. As we will see, if I read Revelation literally, it will put me in one camp. If I read it symbolically, it will put me in one or two other ones. How we read the Bible then leads to where we fall in relation to this discussion. So then let's look at the first one, postmillennialism. This is the idea that Christ returns after the millennium. Now, some postmillennialists take this millennium as a literal 1,000 years. Some take it as a symbolic period of time, remembering that the word 1,000 is a symbol for heaps, multitude, masses thereof. Now, postmillennialists agree with amillennialists in terms that Revelation 20 is more symbolic than literal. As a whole, though, as I said, there is a disagreement there in some cases. They also agree on the general course of events. That is, you have the first coming of Christ, and then you have the second coming of Christ, and all of the end time events will then happen at that second coming, and that's it. All right, game over, man, game over. Now that's a postmillennial view. But the difference between a postmillennial view and an amillennial view is, the postmillennial view is that things will get better before the return of Christ. That this millennium is referring to a golden age of righteousness that happens in our world where the majority of people, if not all of them, will become Christian and then Christ will return. Okay, that is the view of postmillennialism. It's like amillennialism, first coming, second coming, boom, all in one. But it sees a ramp up, a gradual decrease of persecution of the church, and to a point where everything's amazing, and then Christ comes. Okay? Now, the problem, one touchstone here is the Great Commission. They believe that will be entirely successful. They point to Psalms 2, I will make the nations your heritage and the ends of the earth your possession. But a key problem that I have with this position is that Scripture clearly indicates that things will get worse, not better, before the return of Christ. I see this in 1 Timothy 4 verse 1. The Spirit clearly says that in later times some will abandon the faith and follow deceiving spirits and things taught by demons. 2 Timothy 3:1, but mark this, there will be terrible times in the last days. And then Matthew 24, there's a whole thing there as well. These are pictures of a bleak lead up to Christ's return, and not a victorious, glorious moment leading up to Christ's return. So I'm not necessarily, don't find the postmillennial view compelling. All right? So then let's put that to one side. Then let's look at premillennialism. Okay? So millennium, 1,000, that the 1,000 years happens before Christ fully returns. Now this group believes that Christ will return, take all those who are his to be with him. Then there will be a short period of tribulation, like persecution, hardcore persecution of the church where Satan is kind of let loose. And then there'll be 1,000 years of Christ's reign on earth, literal reign on earth. Christ then destroys this, then Satan is let loose again. There's a rebellion grows up. Christ destroys the rebellion, judges the world, and then ushers in the eternal state. Okay? So this position comes from a more chronological and literal reading of Revelation in general. And so an example of this is that it sees Revelation 19 happening before Revelation 20. An amillennial view will see Revelation 19 and 20 talking about the same thing, but from a different angle. And we'll go into that a little bit more later. So it's very much literal and it's very much chronological, and as such, reading Revelation in that way leads them to split up the end time events. Whereas postmillennial and amillennial have it all in one at Christ's return, premillennial splits it up. So you have tribulation, then you have the rapture, or depending on which premillennialism you are, and then you have the 1,000-year reign, and then you have the judgment as another coming and then a judgment. Can you kind of see that? So they've taken the end time events and split it up over a longer historical period. Now, when I talk about premillennialism, I then need to talk about the two types of premillennialism. I know, please bear with me. Have you guys got does anyone not have the sermon outline? Sam, can you go and get the sermon outline and just give it to people if they put their hand up? When we're talking about this stuff, it's just really helpful if you have it in front of you because I'm using big words, all right? Now, historic premillennialism, the word is historic because it's the type of premillennialism that used to be held in ancient times. Dispensational millennialism, if we can go to the next slide, thanks Yusuf. Dispensational premillennialism dispensationalism as a whole believes that the history of the world can be kind of split up into eras of time or ages or dispensations, with each era, dispensation being a distinct era of God's activity in human history. So God worked differently here, then he worked differently here, then he worked differently here, then he worked differently here. Okay? So dispensational premillennialists believe that. Now, historic premills will sometimes read it symbolically, sometimes read Revelation literally. Dispensational premills will pretty much consistently read Revelation literally and chronologically. The next difference is that they put the rapture in different places. Historic premill puts the rapture after the tribulation. Go back one. Yep, there we are. Historical premill put the rapture after the tribulation, whereas dispensational premill put the rapture before the tribulation. So Jesus secretly takes those who are his up, then bad things happen, whereas bad things happen and then Jesus secretly takes things up and then comes back. Does that kind of make sense between the two? They also see the standing of Israel and the church in post-Christ times as different. Dispensational premills still see that Israel is a distinct and separate part of the church, and as such has a distinct and significant role in the end times that the church as a whole does not have. Whereas historic premillennialism, I know this is really hard, I apologise for that, they believe that Israel and the church is one, and that there is no special second tiers in that. And in that way, that is the same also as amillennialism. So you'll hear people talk about the special role that Israel has at the end times. That is a dispensational premillennial viewpoint. Okay? So let me sum up the difference between the two before we move on. Historic, read Revelation sometimes literally, sometimes not. Dispensational will read it all literally, for the most part. They put the rapture in different places and they treat Israel differently. So then coming back to the pop culture version of the rapture, that only falls in this one category. Out of the four categories, it only falls in the one category of dispensational premillennialism. I say this because I had a conversation with a godly friend the other day. And I told them that I didn't believe in the rapture in the left behind sense of the term. And they were shocked. They were really close, they loved me very greatly, but they had this look on their face like I was, renouncing my faith, that I was no longer a Christian. And that is not a helpful way to view any of this. Like I said, we must view it humbly, we could easily be wrong, and it's okay if we disagree. But also, there is this rapture as a concept is so baked into our Christian understanding, especially from a Western standpoint. So a commentator talked about how he went to Romania and talked about the rapture, and they didn't know what he was talking about. It very much comes from only one specific way of looking at the end times. It's not actually as dominant as often we can be led to believe, and then I blame the Left Behind series and Nicolas Cage for that. Partly. Okay, so we got post-mill. We don't like that because we see things as getting worse, not better. We got pre-mill, historic and dispensational, and they're different again, but the key thing is they split up the end time events over a longer period of time. And then finally we have amillennial. This group sees the millennium as being symbolic. And not literal, and rather it refers to the many years between Christ's first coming and Christ's second coming. So it sees then the end time events all happening at once at Christ's second coming that could therefore happen at any time. Now, big questions that we have here is, well, what do you mean? Is Christ reigning victorious now? Well, the amillennial view will say, yes, he is in the now and the not yet. That Satan, therefore, as Revelations 2 and 3 suggests, is bound, and as a result, the gospel of Christ is having a greater impact in our world because Satan is bound. Now, Satan is still active. There is still persecution of the church and the Christian believers. He's still doing stuff. But because he is bound, he is not doing what he previously could have done or did in the terms that not as many people knew about Jesus before then. Not many people knew about the one true God before he was bound. His bounding has allowed the explosion of the church. His bounding has allowed the gospel of Christ to go into a lot of the nations, of which, of course, there are still some that do not know, but vast majority of people have access to the gospel in some way. And there are still missional organisations like WEC that are working to get it into those other ones that still do not. There are many arguments here, like it's literally a whole other thing. But let me give you one argument for this. Mark 3, Jesus is talking about how the strong man must be bound before the house can be plundered. One reading of this passage is that the strong man is Satan, that Jesus has bound the strong man, and therefore is able to take all those who are his. Therefore is able for the gospel to go out. Therefore is able for salvation of those who believe. Okay? So that's one understanding of it. Okay. So then let's sum it up. And we'll come back a little bit to Amil in a moment. But let's sum up the categories. Okay? Post-mill, symbolic, millennium, things get better than Christ. Premillennial, basically splits up the events and sees it happening at different times, that there will be, in the dispensational view, that there will be a rapture, a secret rapture, where Christ returns and only takes up those who are his, period of tribulation and persecution, and then Christ returns and begins a literal 1,000-year reign on earth. And then you have the judgment and the lead up to the new heavens and the new earth. Okay? Then finally, amillennial sees the 1,000 years as symbolic, that Christ is reigning now in a now and not yet tension, and also that Satan is bound, not inactive, but not able to prevent the gospel going forward as he would have done if he was not bound. And then this will end at the end times event when Christ returns, takes all those who are his, judges the living and the dead. We have the new heavens and the new earth. Now, as I say this, we need to remember that I'm saying the big ticket items in all of these different cases. And so if you if you miss everything else, remember, the end times events are confirmed. Christ is coming. There will be judgment. There will be blessing for those who are his. All right. So then I land in one of these camps, and I wanted to spend a little bit of time to unpack why I landed in the camp that I do. Many of you who have been paying attention will be able to guess which camp I land in, because I'm very strong that Revelations is not to be read literally, but rather it is to be read symbolically. And then if we do that, I believe I'm led towards an amillennial understanding of the end times. But let's have I want to do a couple of brief reasons of why or how I've landed there. The first one is the rapture. When Christ returns, I don't see it as a secret taking up of those who are his, but rather a loud, proclaiming, booming voice that all nations will hear at the same time. And one example of this is in 1 Thessalonians 4:16. For the Lord himself will come down from heaven with a loud command, with the voice of the archangel, and with the trumpet call of dead, and the dead in Christ will rise first. I don't see this as a secret rapture. I see this as a loud command and trumpet call of God. I see this as a public rapture of all of those who are his, all at the same time. My next reason is that I don't read Revelation literally. Instead, I read it symbolically as apocalyptic literature should be read. A premillennial view will read the book literally. The 1,000 years are literal, the 144,000 of God's people are literal, the 1,260 days, the 2 billion mounted troops, all of the sevens, all of the 12s, all of the 4s, they're all literal. My argument would be instead that rather the numbers and revelations are symbolic, they're referring to something. And therefore it changes a lot on how we read Revelation. And what's more is, even the premillennials scholars, I believe, start to struggle when they put a literal lens on Revelation, because then how do you take Christ killing people with a sword that comes out of his mouth as literal? Will there actually be blood as high as a horse's bridle for 200 miles? And there are a number of other examples of this. There is a danger when we read Revelation to take some of it literally and some of it symbolically, because as I talked about last week, then that leads us to reading into the text and not taking out of the text. Okay? So rather, I think it's more helpful to read it all in the one lens or with the one viewpoint. And so that leads me towards amillennialism. I also don't believe it's chronological. There's this technique in televisions and movies where you're watching it. It happens in so many television shows at the moment. It's a trope that starts to get frustrating, where you start to watch the television show, you watch a scene, and then it'll say 3 months later, or 3 months before. And then it shows the whole lead up to that event and gives you a lot greater understanding of that event. But what they end up showing you is the one event multiple times from a slightly different angle. So examples of this in movies is Knives Out, Pulp Fiction, Groundhog Day, and the OG of this concept, Rashomon, an old 50s samurai movie that literally no one has heard of. Well, I think that's what Revelations is doing. Revelations is taking these events, and then rather than saying this will happen, this will happen, this will happen, it'll say this will happen. And then it'll go on a little bit further and go, okay, here I'm looking at this event, but I'm looking at it from a different angle. And here I'm taking this event, but I'm looking from a different angle again. And each angle gives us more and more information, leading up to the pinnacle of Revelation. One example of this is Revelation 19 and 20. A premillennialist will say that it goes dink, 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 whereas an amillennialist would say that no, 19 is one version of the battle, and 20 is another version of that same battle. Not a second battle, but the same battle, but seen from a different angle. One of the examples of this is that, in fact, the final battle scene is described 4 different times in the book of Revelations. You've got it in Revelations 9, Revelation 16, and then I would argue Revelations 19 and Revelations 20, with chapter 20 not to be read chronologically, but rather symbolically. This is called parallelism, and parallelism as a concept is found throughout Revelations. They rehash things. And that thing I just talked about, I'm going to talk about again, but from a different angle, and that's what I would argue is happening here in relation to Revelations 20. Okay. Then another argument of why I've landed in amillennialism is that I'm not a massive fan of separating the end times events, as premillennialism specifically does. Final resurrection, final judgment, victory over death, arrival of the new creation and the second coming of Christ. The amillennial position sees it all in one. The premillennialism splits it up over a period of time. But if you look at 2 Thessalonians chapters 1 to 2, when Paul is talking about the end time events, like Christ returning in glory, like taking Christians to be with him and judging the earth, it is seen as happening all at the one time in history and not split up. So they're kind of the arguments that leads me to a millennial camp, right? But there are many other arguments that could easily lead you just as strongly, if not more so, to a dispensational premillennial camp, because they're the big ones that are in the theology of the moment. I guess what my argument here, what do we do with all this? With all this talk about the different camps of the end times, and it's really hard, and it's big words, and it's really confusing, and I appreciate the graphs, Michael, but it's not really helping me. What applications then do we take out of looking at this stuff as a whole? Well, the first thing is, I think we need to be careful how we read our Bible. I think we come to positions, but we don't actually know why we're at that position. I heard a sermon once, and so I've always been in that camp. I heard my mum talk about this, and so I'm always there. We need to know why we believe what we believe. We need to know that for us as Christians. We need to know that for concepts that we hold strongly, especially when we hold them strongly. If you want to hold a strong position on spiritual gifts, you can do so, but know why you hold it, rather than just landing in a camp without giving it much thought, as is our tendency to do as Christians and the end time. We must study the Bible, study the whole Bible in understanding this and grow in our knowledge and understand and our willingness to tackle these kind of things. The second thing is, in this whole discussion, we have a tendency to just get mired in the weeds. We get into the little nitty-gritty, and sometimes we just need to take our heads up and go, Jesus is coming. Yeah? And Jesus is victorious. In his death and resurrection, he has defeated sin. He has defeated Satan. He is coming again, and I will live my life in the shadow of his return. I think getting into the technicalities can lead us away from just how awesome is that? Which is sometimes what I think we need to get back to. And that is important that we remember. And then allow those things, allow that framework of the end times to craft and change our behaviour in the now. To make sure that we are ready for Christ's return, acknowledging it could happen at any time. Being motivated by his coming to be more intentional with what we do in the present. And allow that to motivate and encourage our obedience. So there are these 4 camps. And many of you will land in one of them or just wipe it off and say, Christ returns, Christ does what he does, and I'm okay with that. And that's okay. But if we are going to hold a position, I'd encourage you to know why you believe it. The goal here of this sermon is not to go, well, Michael's a mill, so I have to be a millennialist. That's not the idea. The idea is to start to wrestle with this so that we come to an understanding of what happens next, of what Christ will do, of what that may look like. But if you disagree with someone else, then it's okay. We are all brothers and sisters in Christ. We are all seeing his return soon. Back one, please. I'll end with this. Sorry, back one, Jason. I'll end with this. John Frame, a theologian, draws our attention to the most important eschatological point. So far as I can see, every Bible passage about the return of Christ is written for a practical purpose and not to help us develop a theory of history, but to motivate our obedience. And I think that's a good place to land. This discussion can easily get mired into intellectualism, the use of big words, and high-end debate. We must land on where the Bible as a whole, I believe, lands. Christ is coming. Are we ready? Please we pray with me. Dear Lord, this is a difficult area. It's one with conflict and controversy, and so we just ask, Lord, that you will help us as we wrestle with this issue. I pray, Lord, that this sermon will not be the end of the thought on this topic, but rather that it will spur more thought, that it will spur discussions, that it will spur thought, reading, that people will wrestle to come to a better understanding of why they believe what they believe. But Lord, in relation to all that, help us to continue to cast our eyes to you. Help us to continue to see you coming and allow the factual eventuality of that, of your return, of your coming, of your resurrecting all people, of your judgment, of the new heavens and earth. Allow an understanding and emphasis on that to motivate us to live like you, to motivate us to be like you, to motivate us to be intentional in the here and now. Help us, Lord, with this we ask. And I pray, Lord, that you would just bless all conversation that happens after this, that we would be godly in the way that we discuss it. In your name, amen.